Thanks for coming. So many people, I wouldn't expect that. Thanks Avery for being tonight here. We're really lucky indeed, and I would like to present a little bit more, Avery, not to make it too long, but also quote maybe the titles of a few books, because she's the author of Keeping Good Time, Reflection on Knowledge, Power and People, and this book also, which is quite a seminal, called Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination. And she was also the editor of Mapping Multiculturalism and Body Politics, among other works. So Avery is an educator, a writer, and a radio producer. A writer because also she's been not only publishing and writing books, but also she's been working with different artists recently, with German artist Ines Schaber for Documenta 13 on a project called The Workhouse. More recently with artist and architect Céline Condorelli, who's been developing a new collaborative project entitled How to Work Together. And she's been also collaborating with the Swiss-British artist Auriel Orlot on his latest show, Unmade Films. So maybe at some point in the discussion we will be able to discuss some of the works or the ideas that connect sometimes some works. If I make it also really short, but then I use some things that you can find on some websites, because there's a website with a lot of writings you can read for free and download. Let's say our current writing aims to comparatively understand the nature of captivity and confinement today. It means its means of dispossession and what's required to abolish it. So we could say that it's a strange idea to invite Avery, because she's really working on this confinement, prison, and terror also. But there's a few, I think, themes which connect that we will probably develop tonight also. And one of the big themes is, of course, the question of the haunting that I've been particularly interested in. And so we will discuss a little bit the show here, of course, but also we will probably relate to some older works and to the work that I've been doing by revisiting the heritage of Roland Barthes. Let's say a part of his biography. So I won't say maybe more about your collaboration with Ines here, but maybe say a word about that the Workhouse, this project for Documenta 13, was connected to a former monastery which became afterwards a prison and a detention center, and later on a sort of closed center for young girls. And that you connected actually the Workhouse as not only an exhibition but also a workshop with what you've been developing now for, I think it exists for a lot of years, but that you are reactivating the Outthorn archive. I don't pronounce it probably, I think. And that you work there as a keeper of this archive. So I hope you will tell us a little bit more about it. Because this archive records the living and intellectual history of the arrival and existence of a group of runaways, secessionists and indifferent, who form autonomous zones and settlement and have receded from living as obedient subjects. So you've been particularly interested in this, in the lives of those kind of people for years. The tonight invitation doesn't come with a very strict program. On the contrary, I thought it could be based on the impact and the question raised by Avery's work. And as I say, most precisely about what is written in Ghostly Matters. And the invitation made to her readers in that book of taking into account the social dimension of haunting. So when I say the social dimension of haunting, I mean that it's not only the solitary, personal, psychological dimension of haunting. And starting from there, trying to find a way to do something with it, because situations of haunting are usually produced by very powerful demands, in which forms of repression needs to be stopped. There are different questions or concepts that I would like to discuss with Avery, but there are also some images and research material that I would like to share with you and explain a little bit what it is about. And maybe I hope also through the questions and the conversation that will follow that we try to locate also some lines of light. That's also the idea of this meeting and discussing the practice, is like trying to raise questions about the material I'm confronting at the moment. I think there's a lot of things to process for me. Because I opened, as usually, too many doors at the same time, so I have to deal with different kinds of, different tracks, let's say. And one of them is, of course, the work of Chilatendu, which is shown in the duo show. And the other door that has been opened is the one of André Ombredan, of course, which is the French psychologist. Which I show some films in the show, and linked to that, I'm actually working on a film project called La Poule d'Ombredan, Ombredan's Chicken. So I would also say this. Let's say, excuse my own circumvolution and the possible change from one subject to another that may sound abrupt tonight. In French, we say, for this we have an expression that says passer du coq à l'âne. Literally to move from the chicken to the donkey. As there is a chicken in that story, you know, this La Poule d'Ombredan, Ombredan's chicken, there is also a donkey in the story, because Ombredan in French, it means the shadow of the donkey. So yeah, it might be a good storyline, or how would you say, a one-liner for tonight, passer du coq à l'âne. If you lose your way in this conversation, please excuse me in advance and follow the running chicken. He probably will bring you back home. So I take also the full responsibility in how I disorganized the talk in several teams. So it's not Avery's fault. And I will also use some quotes, reading some parts in order to grasp different perspectives from where we can better understand the value of Avery's proposals. So we will improvise with knowing that improvisation is also an important moment in the phrasing of one's thought and unthought. In the best case, it can acquire a specific value, a key to the next step of this research. So it can also let behind some silence issue you would like to tackle, so we will spare some time for questions after this discussion. So my main reason for inviting Avery is because a work proposes a methodology, I would say. A methodology for thinking a complex situation linked to subjugated knowledge. This concept we will discuss a little bit later. So it's not a methodology for visual artists, of course, but you could say it gives a framework and a toolbox to approach this concept of subjugated knowledge. We will come back to it later. And as we are in a lecture context, Avery, I would like to discuss some thoughts and some concepts you've been elaborating very precisely, or concept from other thinkers you use or you relate to, like Benjamin, Foucault, and Michael Taussig, that are key to your way of thinking. By tackling issue through concepts and abstraction, I think I try to relate also how I try to translate some abstractions and some concepts into the show. By tackling issue through concepts and abstraction, we can approach some of them also through specific examples and works or stories and anecdotes. So that's why I will tell the story or the anecdote of the chicken also. And also, so now I try to trace the very basic hopes linked to this talk. Maybe Avery also you will be able to bring some light on how you as a sociologist relate to what you call imagination. And more precisely to the social imagination and the importance in that of storytelling as a ritual within a discipline, I would say. A discipline you approach not as a scientific project, but as a cultural practice. So there I try to spot possible terrain, also space, where I think that the upcoming project linked to Ombre d'Âne is very based on, or not based, but is very connected to the ritual storytelling, or the virtue of storytelling. So to situate a little bit how I came to be interested in André Ombre d'Âne, the psychologist, it's based in the research I made for a project that has been shown under the exhibition title My Last Life, and to a film which is the core piece, let's say, of this display and research, a film called Vita Nova, that is actually linked to a cover magazine of Paris Match, French magazine, that the literary critic and semiologist and author Roland Barthes discussed in his book Mythologies in the mid-50s, and that became some kind of icon, I would say, for the post-colonial thinkers in the Anglo-Saxon world, much more than in the French, on the French scene. And I will only show tonight a very short extract or scene that was not edited in the film, that only I think Avery have seen so far.
And the last students at Berkeley.
Ah, yeah, and some students. So we'll discuss this also. So let's say, a bonus, a bonus scene from this film. And so Barthes, in several books, actually quote or relate to Ombre d'Âne. And already when I was making this research in 2009, I was really, let's say, shocked or challenged by what I was reading, because Ombre d'Âne was mentioning, Barthes was mentioning Ombre d'Âne as a psychologist who would screen films to Congolese people in order to study their reactions. But we speak of some, work, a practice of Ombre d'Âne in Congo, in Belgian Congo, in the mid-50s. So it's quite late, of course. And so at that moment, I tried to research a little bit Ombre d'Âne and who could it be, someone who would have such a weird idea. Noticing also that, of course, the name as a quality, a novelistic quality, and that if you know a little bit Roland Barthes, you will feel or understand that the novelistic quality of the name itself is already an argument to use it. But so I'm going to quote a part from the last book that Barthes wrote, and which you might know, is Caméra lucide à la chambre claire. And Barthes writes, in Ombre d'Âne's experiment, the black see on his screen only the chicken crossing one corner of the village square. So he makes a he relates to film screening in Congo, where the black people only see the chicken crossing the screen, the corner of the screen. I too, in the photograph of two retarded children at an institution in New Jersey, hardly see the monstrous head and pathetic profile. What I see, like Ombre Dance Black, is the off-center detail. The little boy's huge Danton collar, so makes reference to a color, old-fashioned color. The girl's finger bandage. I am a primitive, a child, or a maniac. I dismiss all knowledge, all culture. I refuse to inherit anything from another eye than my own. So this is the moment where Barthes is trying to also create an abstraction and a concept that is referred to as the punctum. And this is a concept that you, Avery, also have been actually using in Ghostly Matters at some point. In saying that the punctum is what haunts a picture, and that is also related to the photography's power to haunt. So maybe we could start with this relation between Barthes and the haunting, maybe not too long, so that we can actually go back to Gilatendo as we mentioned earlier, because now I'm beginning with something else that we agreed on before starting. So I disorganized myself, even the introduction. Does my first question make sense or not at all, Avery?
Perhaps. It seems really like starting in the middle. But first of all, let me say I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Vincent, and Vim, thank you for hosting me too. Okay, you want to start right in the middle with that? Okay.
Or we come back later to that. I just wanted, actually, it's true that I'm sorry, I wanted to connect also with the previous work, and but it's maybe because I still had in mind that I would show this film extract at the beginning. So maybe we can start with this.
Yes, I mean, unless you really, I think we should talk a little bit more before we get to this particular bit in Barthes, because I think this is, a very problematic statement of Barthes.
Yeah.
In other words, the chicken is not an off-center detail. And it's not at all clear to me that it even would function like a punctum in the experiments. And since nobody even knows what the experiments are yet. But okay, we're going to have like the one thing that Vincent was very, very interested in was talking about the cut-up and montage. So we're just going to have the conversation like that, I think. Bits of fragmented things, which will be nice. It's okay. I mean, the one thing that perhaps is something to start with this, which is a lead-in to saying something about why you're in a show with an artist with 25 names, has to do with the colonial field and the colonial context that is in the background of this statement by Barthes, and why we might need to have some different way to read presence of the chicken, how the chicken might be read, in what context these Congolese villagers are being shown, these films, and so on and so forth. So we might back out a little bit to the field in which this, I mean, just one thing I will say is I've read a lot of Barthes over many years, and I never noticed I just completely always skipped over this thing about this guy's chicken. Didn't know who he was, didn't know anything about it. It never stopped me. So for me, interestingly, as an element in the text, it never had that moment that Bart identifies, or what he calls the third meaning, or the punctum in a still image. The still image can be words on a page, where you stop and it leads you outside of itself to what it isn't showing. And in that sense, the photograph is always, of course, showing you something that's not there, and that paradoxical quality of it is what immediately takes it into the realm of haunting, and why Bart describes it as being very much associated with death. But here the context matters, it seems to me. In other words, that it's we shouldn't make an epistemological principle out of Bart's observation. We might make some other kind of more critical comment about what's present and absent in the colonial field, and that's where you started, and that's where the beauty, to some extent, of Vita Nova is, to do that. So people are seeing something, do you?
Yeah, so I've been, now it's just also a random selection of works by Gilatendo. I show also, it's really like not a selection, I would say, it's just a small part of what still is conserved actually in the library, the Royal Library in Brussels. So I show not only abstract works, but some other more figurative works. They're full of chicken, by the way.
The chicken is important.
Yeah, but we only know at the end why it's important for me.
Yes, but in Yoruba culture, the five-toed chicken creates the world. I mean, the chicken is not an unimportant animal. The chicken is used as currency. The chicken is kind of a big deal, we would say.
As a sacrifice device also.
The chicken has great symbolic capital, yeah.
So yeah, the images that are shown now are held by the Royal Library in Brussels. There are nearly, I think, 100 artworks that have been mostly donated by the people who actually took care of Gilatendo in the end of the year 20s and beginning of the years 30s. So to make it short, one colonial administrator called Georges Thierry was sent to Congo, and he was interested in art, and he had a connection most probably with another guy who was a high-rank colonial administrator in Brussels, and he would send him some works first by an artist called Albert Loubaki, who had also, how do you call it, paintings on his hut, wall paintings. And for this, that was the same story for Gilatendo. When Georges Thierry was moved from one city to another in Congo, he noticed the paintings on the walls, and then gave Gilatendo some colors, some papers, and actually bought all the production that he would then send to his contact in Brussels. And the other guy in Brussels was very much connected with the art scene and with the literary milieu. So the story is that in '31 they have their first show, Gilatendo and Loubaki, and Gilatendo has a show with Magritte and Paul Delvaux in the mythic Le Centaure Gallery in Brussels. And there's like a critical success of the work, because it's discussed and then it's shown in different cities, in Rome, in a colonial exhibition context, where Mussolini visits the paintings, and there are pictures of Mussolini in front of those works. Well, there's a lot of story to tell about this. It's not, I think, not so interesting to tell the story as such, but to notice that in the year 40s, in the late 40s, the colonial administrator who was working in the Ministry of Colonies in Brussels actually is going to sell a few works to the Cabinet des Estampes in the Royal Library, and that will be the only people who actually will buy some works. So it's a commercial how do you say, fiasco, and in the end of the year 50s, this one guy is going to donate a lot of works. The problem is that those works are particularly unknown. Most of them have never been, they've been preserved, and they're preserved in very good condition, but they've not been reproduced. There is barely no academic work, and only 6 of them have been shown in a group show, actually, in the 90s. So the more I gather information around Gilatendo, and they are quite difficult to find, and around Georges Thierry, the more I actually wonder about this situation, and something that I read personally as probably as a very interesting blind spot of colonial modernity, because the question of the work of Gilatendo is actually bringing to the front a lot of very interesting issue in relation to the artistic practice, and also the persona of the artist, and the context of the invention of the artist, as we could say that Gilatendo has partly been invented by his patron, Georges Thierry. So you have to figure out that at some point you have someone who is actually making wall drawings, and then shifting from the wall to the paper support. Then it's being inventing also as an artwork, and then it's going to be signed, because one of the conditions, of course, of making it a work of art is having a work signed. And there, I think there's a very interesting dimension in the practice of Gilatendo, because here you can see that a lot of works are unsigned. In the exhibition, you can see that most of them are signed, but with different ways. Here we have a good example in the image of how the name is splitted in different parts, and also how actually the pattern reproduction is mostly interrupted by the signature itself. So the moment where the repetition is interrupted is the place where the signature is taking place, and how this is actually, by a close looking at all the variation of the name, we could speculate about the possibility of having Gilatendo actually responding to the commission in a way that would be, you could say, an anecdote and a detail, but if you reread it properly, then you could say that actually it has another value, or that has another meaning, probably, that the artist is himself, by rephrasing or respelling his proper name, actually creating some kind of counter gesture, or some kind of oppositional gesture towards the commission, and towards the obligation of of having the work signed. So this is a little bit the proposition that is made through these names, labels that are shown in the exhibition. And yeah, so it's a speculation, but I think it's only based on the first part of the research, and the moment that we could elaborate a little bit even more about that, and maybe find some other works that it could enrich itself as a possible track for thinking about how there is also in there a creative act that is being performed within the work and within the proper name. Of course, because you know that also the separation between the ethnographical artifact and the so-called work of art will be the moment where the author is known and authentified by not only a name but a signature.
One of the things that was very interesting for me in preparing to come here to speak with you is that two elements of this new project of Vincent's I really didn't know very much about. So one has to do with the psychological tests, the thematic apperception test known as the TAT Congo test, which he will get to, I'm sure, speak about in a moment. And the other, of course, is the artist Nintendo, who I did not really know very much about. And Vincent sent me an article by, and she must be an art historian, a German art historian, no?
Kentrid Langenol. She's an art historian.
Yeah, and so there's quite a bit of detail about the story that you've been telling a little bit about the artist, but she ends this article. For me, it was probably one of the most interesting bits towards the end, where she makes 2 points, and to me they're interrelated. And the first is her point that one of the things that has been obscured is the invention of a West in the imagination of Africans. And she's making the point that Thierry and Perrier and so on, that they're not only them, couldn't really see that Africans would have independent intentions, in this case a kind of imaginary of the West, a cultural, philosophical invention, a mode of appropriating the West, whose, in effect, conditions of possibility were colonialism, but not the limits of its existence, to use this lovely phrase that you end Vita Nova with. And she ends by saying this. She says, the commissioned works by, how do you say his name?
Cilatendo?
No, not Cilatendo.
Lubaki?
Lubaki. Mm-hmm. And Cilatende were not the earliest, she says, artistic responses to the conditions of modernity. To treat them as the beginning of African modernism reduces them, defining them too strongly in terms of Europeans' reach. Their predecessors were the murals, public murals that were painted, which can be read, she says, as acts of emancipation. Paintings on paper, produced for a European market, may rather have primarily constituted an opportunity to make money. So this, for me, is a very, very important statement that she makes at the end of the article. Not just the statement, but the standpoint that's embedded in it, that for me would constitute a kind of starting point for investigating precisely what or who is in the blind spot. So if something is obscured, if this invention of the West is obscured, that there's something there in the blind spot, this is for me the most crucial thing. The only thing of interest I think I have to say about the blind spot is just that there's always something living and breathing in the blind spot. The question is what or who. So the part of the reason why I think the question of methodology in particular emerges so strongly is having said, well, there's always something in the blind spot, who or what, how do you find it, then everything is up to the process of finding it. But so it's right at this little place that can launch something like a critique of colonialism, or in this case, very much a kind of colonial liberal relationship between cultural patron and artist, gets activated from the point of view of the standpoint of the colonized. Right, so you begin already this process, why storytelling? Because we have to begin to imagine that the artist might have viewed the watercolors, valuable to the Belgians as cultural capital, as merely a means to make money, as opposed to the murals. So that becomes, to me, this activation point, because if we start here, we might also have a way to read the nature of those multiple identities staged in the various signatures. On the one hand, a kind of distanciation from a communal self that has a very different kind of public responsibility and relationship to others in the local urban milieu. I mean, you can only act up so much in that context, then you have to behave. But also, in other words, I mean, what's he saying? You can buy something by me, but you cannot buy me. I mean, that's essentially what that's saying. There's also, I think, a kind of mischievousness to it. You want a specimen of Africanness? Well, here's several. Take them all. You can have them all. It's a kind of giving away of the proper name is already to, in effect, devalue the individuation that the signature of the valuable artwork as currency holds in a Western context, completely different than the public mural in the communal African context where something is painted, he doesn't own it at all. In fact, its meaning is determined in a set of conversations, discussions, disputations, to some extent, inventions, fabulations that are made in a communal context. Doesn't belong to him. It does this whole sense of private property as the object to be held. It doesn't function in that way. And so, already the whole relationship between image and story, which I think is a basic kind of theme and problematic that both you and I have worked on in our respective ways. It's also something interesting about the test we'll talk about. But I mean, remember, one of the things I learned about this article, which was very interesting to me, was that the watercolors were first shown by Perrier as illustrations for a book of Congolese folk tales.
Yeah, part of them, yeah.
Part of them.
No, so yeah, the story is also that Thierry was interested. Of course, it was a sort of fashion at that, because Sandra had published his Niggers, Conte Nègre, or Negro Fables or something like that. So he had collected and rewrote. And Thierry actually also commissioned clerks to go into village and collect stories. And started from there, he proposed Perrier to have a book published. It's quite amazing also because it's the first, now it's considered as the first also book written by a Congolese, because what Perrier is going to change is that Thierry, being in Congo, collecting the stories, want to put his name on the cover. But then the Perrier, who is the colonial administrator in Brussels, say, okay, but these have been collected by a Congolese, so it should be signed by this guy. And that's how it became now seen as the first written book by a Congolese writer. Of course, it's also something to discuss because little parts were rewritten and so on. But the book was illustrated by Gilatendo, so it's also the first printed book with images by so-called Congolese artists. So of course, we tend to reread all this as the first time ever. So of course, history needs to have introductions and dates in order to have landmarks and birthday and install a chronology and So, yeah, I think that being interested in gelatendos is also at some point. I think that the fact that there are so many works that have not been properly addressed, also not, yeah, that have not been shown, also that it creates several questions about the reason why the situation is so. And I tend to think also that there is probably an impossibility to look at them in a way that we can do today also, because we can address them from a totally different perspective, and we can see also in the show how we can personally relate to some works on very different levels, because there are 9 works, I think, and all of them are very different. And some of them you would say, okay, this one looks more like tribal patterns, and some other is completely nearly, you would look at it as a Paul Klee piece, and it has that nearly that quality, or like a Sophie Tauber pieces. And so we tend to enter those kind of I would say even pattern recognition, you know, like displacing one work onto another, and then connecting to situation and images with what we have experienced before, what we know. So I think that the question of the show, of course, is haven't addressed up to now the character of Ombre d'Âne, who much later is going to come and test the abstract intelligence of Congolese people, and mostly in the very same region that Chilatendo had been working years before. So what I try to reorganize in that way, that's why I use this. I speak about a constructivist scenario. I try to reconstruct, of course, a situation from the present with what we can gather as information and think through those different forms, but how actually Ombre d'Âne is reframing what we could call not only intelligence but intelligibility of a fact, and how the scientific device and how the tests themselves try to actually create the conditions for an understanding of what intelligent is. But I think that here in the show I try to put this at a distance and try to reorganize the relationship between the scientific device and the artistic effect of the image also, and try to confront also or try to build some parallels between what we think we recognize, but actually it's not, it goes beyond that. Of course, I think the show is much more about how things are framed and how facts are being produced also and constructed themselves.
Okay, I think you should say a little bit more about that, because to the extent that you have put these paintings in a visual context for us, the visual context is the small films of the pattern recognition testing that the psychologists were doing in the Congo, also some of the reports that are in the other room. And so there the question, it seems to me, is about misrecognition. And so in the artist that we discovered today that we didn't know that much about, who's working at the same time in your detective trail of crumbs from Bach to Obredon to Chilatendo and so on, you don't take us, we are not taken back to correct our theories of modernism. That is not the context. The context has to do with this problematic of the misrecognition of the African to a large extent. And this is what I liked about where Catherine ends in terms of saying that what has been suppressed is any possibility of understanding, thinking through what it was that the African artists at this time, or the people who are the subject of these psychological tests, are thinking back. And so the fundamental misrecognition of them as subjects of an artistic modernity, or subjects of a psychological pathology or normality, depending on the case. Some of this particular psychological test that Vincent is focused on, the TAT, the thematic apperception test, in some cases it sounds like here was used a little bit less for psychological diagnostics. In other cases, it was very much used for that purpose. But these are tests where people were tricked. I mean, this is also very important about them. They were told that their imagination, their creativity, their literary abilities were being tested. They were shown images.
I'm going to actually play some, in the background, some images that are linked to this other kind of test. So now Avery is speaking about this other test that is not in the show, which is called the Congo TAT. No, but I try to make it clear.
The book is in the book.
The book is in the show, so that's why I consider really the show as a prologue to the next step. So here in the show, you have really the first row of tests that Ombradani is actually experiencing onto Congolese there, before adapting another test, American test, which is really famous to the Congolese people. And this particular test, maybe you want to say something about it, because also Avery researched the TAT and found some other versions.
I got completely obsessed with this test, got really interested in this test, finding all the different versions of it. I do think on this point, though, the distinction between the psychological tests and doing the psychological profiles, which in the African context, which was really different than in the US, like the context of African Americans, although more like when this test was given to Native peoples, that the pattern recognition tests, or what I would consider the misrecognition tests, that the problem of abstraction is the same. It's the same generic problem. The application of the site of the problem of abstraction and reduction of the complex person in their historical social milieu is just a different form. But the TAT tests, these perception tests, were developed by an American psychologist named Murray in the 30s. He actually, we think, developed these tests at the suggestion of a young undergraduate student of his at Radcliffe, a woman named Claudia Roberts. And then they were really designed with a woman who was not a PhD psychologist. She often went by the term lay psychologist. She was his lover, and she made all the images, the drawings. Christiana Morgan was her name. And she was a patient of Jung's, very famously. She was the subject of Jung's vision seminars in the 30s. And I say all this because she also becomes a bit of a ghost in this story too. She is erased as being really the author of this study and so on. But the procedure is fairly straightforward. People were shown 2 sets of 10 images each, and they were given a set amount of time and asked to say a story about what they saw in the image. And the images get increasingly more abstract, obscure, difficult as the series goes on. it was very important that the images have a certain level of ambiguity so as to stimulate room for storytelling. The theory was very simply that the storyteller would become so involved in telling the story or making up a story about what they saw in the pictures that they would forget that they were projecting their psychological personality and their motivations and intentions. And the trained interpreter of the stories would then be able to identify psychological disorders or patterns. This is the theory of it. Okay, it's kind of an amazing thing. If you think about all the little bits and pieces of this, are pretty extraordinary.
So just a word about the few images that are behind. So the first images that you've seen are the black and white pattern recognition that as in the show, and here now we see detail of the plates from the Congo TAT. So this adaptation of the test that Avery has just presented. And then later on you will see in this visual edit the full plates actually, and it's a mix of drawings and photographs. Most of them have been manipulated, and they come from actually the propaganda photographic archive from the colonial service, so sort of photographic agency who is actually only producing documents for the colonial authorities and distributed in Belgium. So this is a good example also of an image which has been completely manipulated. This guy is actually, the story is interesting because I found interviewing people who actually know the original picture completely by coincidence, and who told me this guy is actually a judge from a customary tribunal court. And so you can see how here also how all the images have been blackened, and the whole white paper, which is actually a report or a judgment, has been completely erased. And yeah, then we will see some other photographs also that have been manipulated, and I can say a word about it later.
Yeah, I mean, the original Murray images were, I think, very much, many of them were designed to model, they look almost like soap opera scenes from popular magazines, which would have short stories and imagings. That's kind of what they look like. They don't look like that. There are some kind of scary woodcuts, and as I say, they get a bit more strange as they go on, but they're not so interesting as images. And one of the things that intrigued me was there were a set of extensions of this test to non-white populations. The first to Hopi and Navajo. I haven't seen the images on those, so I don't know what they look like. The big one was in 1949 for African Americans. And there the images are identical to the original set, but the faces are African American faces.
Yeah,
so, I mean, to me this is extraordinary that, you know, in 1949 African Americans were not understood to have their own visual culture by the psychologists. You know, in other words, that the idea of making something that would be culturally specific to black Americans meant that you just put a black face in a white image. You know, I mean, there was no recognition of any African American painters, of an African American visual or even literary culture. And that's really, for me, one of the interesting things about the Congolese study, all of them, is the presumptions that are being made again about individualization, private possession of story. I mean, the idea that these individuals would project their individual psychology in their stories is really quite absurd. And if you actually read the stories he collected, I don't know what there's a lot of death in the stories. I mean, you also really, I really had the impression, just of the few that I've read, that they are also at every point reminding the test taker that this is a completely deathly situation. Like, every story is about someone did something wrong, the bad spirits came. It's just like every story is saying, this is all wrong, this is all wrong, every one of them. They seem to have completely missed this altogether.
And a few details about these images. So it's really like the material as I collected it. Now here we have also some other plates that are found and that are probably sort of site Congo TAT test for workers, because you have to imagine also that when Ombredan was working there and making his research, he was actually there for spotting the right people in order to work for the mines, for minière or for diamonds and gold mines in Congo. So here we have like photographs from the same, probably from the same propaganda colonial archive that have been manipulated, and clearly not by a painter, maybe by Ombredan himself, I don't know. But then we have these very strange kind of images. So all these that we see now, the plates are linked to this B, I would say B, Congo TAT, second version, or not second version, sort of specific set of plates, probably for workers. This one also. So yeah, we have details and then some more general views. So maybe this brings us also to the to this relation between power and knowledge, and maybe to this concept that you use quite a lot, and that I mentioned in the beginning. So I don't know in what way we could relate to this concept in this case. My opinion is that for this project I really have to actually gather some people around the table, around the plates, and try to articulate something which is not based on my own subjectivity, rereading those images as images, of course, but much more as a complex set and of relationship that have been at the basis of the formation of these images, I would say. So basically the first intention is to rework with the plates that I considered basically as a ghost storyboard, you could say, and how these images need to be actually reanimated in order to tell the story of their making or of their formation, I would say, or how they could be served or used as the base of a speculation about their what they contain, but also what they how they can be processed in order to I don't know how to tell it, but the idea that there is a set of images that are there to be animated, that are somehow fixed, and you could say frozen.
Can I say something here?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. No, just to come in on this point about what it is that you would like to animate. I think this is really the crucial question, because I mean, I'm much more simple-minded in many ways than you are. I mean, almost all the work that I've ever done is trying to work from the, if you like, the standpoint or the point of view of those people who are most kind of grieved and silenced and dispossessed. I'm kind of like a missing person scholar. That's kind of what I feel like. And it's, for me, part of why there is a limit to methodological procedures, whether they're in any field, that rely only on deconstructing or exposing the invention or the construction of something, whether that be artistic subjects, race subjects, disciplinary regimes, image systems, economy, so on and so forth. This is very important, but I think in and of itself, it is not a sufficient method for actually animating, either explaining if that's what you're needing to do, or bringing to life in some way, conjuring, animating the differences, the actual stuff that is the person, the stuff, the life that has been displaced or silenced or repressed by those very representations. And this is where I like Foucault's two types of subjugated knowledge, and often draw upon that definition that he gives of, on the one hand, the first type of subjugated knowledge we're more familiar with, what official knowledge kind of represses in its own kind of institutional languages and institutions and archives. It's kind of unconscious. But there's a second type, which we could just say more simply as a kind of marginalized or discredited knowledge from below and from outside of those official institutions of knowledge or cultural production. And so that knowledge that's been disqualified as non-conceptual, naive, primitive, inferior, not scientific enough, or in more sophisticated versions, you know, in other words, that doesn't have its own intention. We were just talking about that. That to the extent that these knowledges certainly are fugitive, sometimes they're also more rebellious, more insurrectionary kinds of knowledges. These knowledges are not just kind of hidden in an institution's discourse, but we could say they are, in effect, an institution's secrets. They're kind of disqualified secrets. So these two often coexist. We find them often tracking both ways. But they're different, and accessing this second type of subjugated knowledge is much more difficult. There aren't easily accessible records of it, where people are no longer living. I mean, this is also where the question you asked about storytelling and invention, and this is partially where it comes in. It has to be invented. I mean, one of the things that I think about, if you haven't seen it, Vincent's film Vita Nova, that is such a beautiful example of how to approach these questions. I think you do that so well. And one of the reasons is I think that the film is kind of meticulous in finding, call it a method, a métier, or medium, whatever, of representation that shows you what's in the blind field. It doesn't just say there's something missing. Oh, Bart missed something. It's sort of like it is activated in that sense, but very much from the, if you like, standpoint. For you, it's an ethical standpoint, but of that young cadet now grown into an old man. And can I just quote, I'm going to quote you now, you quoted me, now I'm going to quote you. As you get to the last line, almost to the last line of your film, and you say, in order to, or you don't, it says the, what do you say, the narration. In order to establish the roots of historical truth, documents should not be raised as witnesses, but as voices. Parimach had silenced the troop child's past, but not his existence. Bart granted him a future. That future was our present. This capacity to distinguish between an institution, a cultural institution, being able to silence something, a past, a construct in that sense, but not an actual person's existence. I think this is a very profound standpoint, and it defines everything that you see and don't see in the film. And so, in that sense, I think that the question of what or from what location you wish to, activate, engage.
Yeah, I think that
All
of course
of this is.
there's this double notion of subjugated knowledge, which is, I think, quite interesting in this case, because we could say that the second sort of it would relate it to Gilatendo, because you can say that I think it's accessible as the artworks are accessible, but the problem is that the institution doesn't do anything with it. Well, I think it's very problematic given the quality and the importance, that we could not give it as an artistic artifact per se, but I think it deserves for some part this valuation of the work, but also much more about the question it raises. I think it's much more because it has an epistemological value, which is so important that it's still there. So I think the ambition is to be able to make this clear, because now the more I'm also trying to grasp the situation of how what we call negrophilia, which is this love for the art of Africa in the early modernism, has been so influential that people like Carl Einstein, that we mentioned also in coming in the car, and I just said that I was reading Carl Einstein. I just knew his name, but now I discovered that how influential he was in actually bringing the first analysis of the African sculpture within the world of art history by a book called Neger Plastique. And it's very interesting because this guy was actually as a soldier in Belgium, and that's because as a soldier he could spend a lot of time in the library of Tervuren, that he could actually write this book that became so influential for Braque, for Picasso. So we know this story that Picasso, and this is part of our cursus, but what's behind again is kind of also missing. So I think there's a very interesting research in that perspective to develop. The other dimension, of course, is much more linked to Ombre d'Âne, and how, when I was speaking about subjectivities, I think that I really need to reprocess the test with, actually, I think Congolese psychologists who have been trained here. The first ambition is actually to connect with people who've been trained here, and I hope probably in the University of Brussels, and to actually start the research within the framework of the university, where Ombre d'Âne was the founder of the university, of the Faculty of Psychology of University of Brussels. I haven't mentioned this, but so he played a very important role. And later on, the ambition is to use the protocol of the test itself in order to write the film, I would say, and the project of the film. So the methodology, and that's why I was so interested to discuss also a little bit, I don't know how the time is running now, your idea also of, or your relation to what you call, what we can call constructivism, and how you relate to that in your own practice. I'm very interested in that. So I would say that again, the project is to develop in the way that, as you mentioned, Barthes, I tried to understand the context of Barthes and to read it and try to understand how we could connect, how I could reconnect different parts of the stories in order to make a film out of it. So, but it's very much using the methodology of Barthes in order to reprocess the material. And in this case, it's the same thing. So it's like trying to enter the logic of Ombredan, trying to understand how does it work, you know, and where does it take? In some, if we speak with the terms of Barthes, at what moment does it make sense for him, and how can he connect this and this and this? So because I think it's all a story of, you know, of bringing bits and pieces together, and how to be able to understand their way of thinking, because it's so hard actually to 50 years later to understand how this was possible. So we have all this contextual research to do in order to understand, I mean, all the story of this psychological test, how they relate to, you know, the early forms of like we speak about projective tests, so tests where people have to project stories onto images. We know the Rorschach test, we've studied this also, where the patient has to tell what he sees in those stains which are informal or that has no clear shape, very ambiguous shape. That's completely related to that story we're telling now, because also Ombredan was the one who introduced Rorschach in France and in Belgium to the French-speaking public, and he was the one who introduced Murray, the very first psychological personality test in France. And so I think we deal with a major character, and with not only a major character, but I mean with ways of thinking and constructing the real in a certain way that is barely understandable with our in our environment, if we've been a little bit trained.
Yeah, I think we should probably take, because it's almost 8:30, take some questions. But about this, I just making me think of, I mean, in some ways, one question would be whether we should understand these psychological tests as a form of racial science and to insert them in that history, which would make them actually quite understandable today, because that science is alive and well. And one thing that you learn if you study imprisonment and criminalization is that that's, of course, a major place where forms of racial science are redeveloped. But we were also talking about this earlier in terms of the movement of psychology itself as a field into really becoming more and more brain science. And so to the extent that it does that, it becomes a racial science in complicated ways. We could talk about the assumptions of that, but there is also then this other, you could say, community of people who are hovering around the margins of this story, and you signal them by suggesting that it might be interesting to talk to contemporary Congolese psychologists today. And that would be the lineage of people who basically were looking to psychology as a field of healing, you know, not just a field that produces knowledge, ethnographic or ethnological knowledge about groups of people, which is partially what these partially the personality testing was used in that kind of science of man classification purpose. It was also used, as you suggested, to create and identify who would be good workers and bad workers in various parts of the world. But then there is always, of course, the history of radical psychologists who are trying to, I mean, we talked about Fanon, you and I talked about Fanon earlier, the history of radical psychologists who's, of course, are confronting a completely different question, which is how to deal with the injury and damage to people that they have suffered as individuals from colonialism, from colonial terror, from various forms of extreme dispossession and political violence. And so those psychologists, of course, are relating to people in a very different way and struggling with other kinds of constructions coming out of their own of their own fields. You asked me what I was doing with Uriel. Well, one of the things I was doing with Uriel was writing about the problem that Palestinian psychologists face today, where they can only get funding for their clinics and for their practice by treating people for something called post-traumatic stress syndrome. And of course, it's a ridiculous diagnostic category for people who are living in the middle of an occupation. Nothing's post anything. And I mean, it's just silly. And in fact, in a kind of sort of horrible irony, a large portion of the definition of what counts as PTSD in the diagnostic and statistical manual that psychologists use is based on the experience of Holocaust victims. So there's a terrible irony in it. But so, for example, these are people whose everyday work lives and personal lives and political lives are taken up with the question of how to help others and how to make life a bit more livable for folks. It's completely removed from all this stuff about personality classification. And so when you start to come into that contemporary mode of engagement with the images, it could be really interesting because folks will be thinking, in terms of the triage that is their everyday life as working psychologists. Mm-hmm. The children who cannot sleep, et cetera. I mean, this is what they're confronting. And so, I mean, just...
Yeah, of course the context is very different, and
well, but it is part of the same
it's partly related,
trajectory,
and of course how it has spread, and but also you were mentioning Fanon, and Fanon is the counter example, or the counter, you could say, the perfect counter example of what Ombre d'Âne was, and but Fanon also was planning to design his own TAT because the Congo TAT at that period was really discussed, and that's why I think it's really a sort of a very controversial object, an artifact that the TAT from '38 is still in use in Algeria today. Not another version, this old version designed by Americans in the 40s. So I know this by psychotherapists who work in Algeria. And also I met the former assistant of Frantz Fanon, who is living in France, and who wrote about this intention of Fanon of designing his own TAT, and he had to stop it because that's the moment where he decided that actually couldn't work anymore in his clinic in Blida in Algeria, that it was impossible, the conditions were impossible, and that he entered FLN in that period. So it's like an intention that was never gone further, but I was, of course, starting to think about how and why and how Fanon would have developed the TAT himself, of course, because it's still a very very strange object. This is just to connect to Fanon, because Fanon is part of that story also, by the fact that he had this intention to make his own version of it.
Yeah.
So maybe I think we've been very long already.
I think we should play the 30 seconds of the Bart quote, because I'll just say this while Vincent sets it up, because he was asking me about how do I relate to the question of storytelling and social imagination, and this will be I'm going to let Bart answer for me a little bit on this, but I have long now no longer work really within my discipline at all, so I've completely sort of abandoned that, which is good, freedom from that. But when I wrote Ghostly Matters, haunting the whole idea of haunting for me was a way of talking about the presence or the remains of either traumatic or violent systems that were supposedly over, like slavery, or were denied, various forms of political repression and so on. But I was as concerned with the problem of how to represent, or in any case to write about violence, the responses to it, the ways in which people made lives that were not completely contained by these systems at all. And I was I wanted to, I still do, this has not changed, to try to find a mode of representation, in my case mostly focused on writing, where things were not distant and bloodless and sort of rationalizing all kinds of stuff that shouldn't be rationalized and so on. And because I was primarily interested in haunting as a kind of onto-epistemological affect or structure, you could say, a state in which something to be done was emerging in response to the presence of trouble that wouldn't go away. So the ghost appears, there's trouble. I was, taken up with this problem, with how to name it, write about it, and in some ways find a way to show it. And the it being this more complicated, animated state of things being made, but also made up, changing, moving, not quite being what we thought they were. And this few seconds that Vincent is going to play is a lovely statement by Barthes. And I would just say that the thing he calls time is what I would like to work.
You would like to call?
I would say the thing that he calls time in this passage, the word time will appear. Mm-hmm. The thing he calls time is what I am trying to figure out how to research, I guess you could say, write about. Yeah. It's hard.
Brecht faisait mettre du linge mouillé dans le panier de l'actrice pour que sa hanche ait le bon mouvement de la blanchisseuse aliénée. C'est très bien. C'est aussi stupide, non? Parce que ce qui pèse dans le panier, c'est pas le linge, c'est le temps, c'est l'histoire. Or, ce poids-là, comment le représenter? Il est impossible de représenter le politique. Il résiste à toute copie, même si on s'épuise à vouloir toujours le rendre vraisemblable. Tu sais, contrairement à cette croyance invétérée de tous les arts socialistes, là où commence le politique, là cesse l'imitation.
Sorry?
You should tell him who he is, who's reading that.
Yeah, I should tell who is reading. So it's Etienne Minungu, the actor who's playing actually the main role in Vita Nova. Well, he's not the main role because the main role is actually Isaac Caboret, but he's the
narrator.
He's the narrator, and he's also the body who crosses the film from time to time. And here it's a text by Barthes about the impossibility to present politics. I don't know if you have questions. So that is, it's a cutscene. It's when we made the film with Etienne, it was also I had this very impossible, not demand, but proposal to learn several texts, short texts like this one, and that he should be able to perform them a little bit on the spot when something was happening. And I worked like that for several takes. And sometimes it would work, but most of the time with difficult text like this, it was inappropriate. So in the end, it was also, since the beginning, also this idea that the film could work only with a voiceover and a body, where I would separate the two and we could reconnect it in the film. But also, I wanted to try things with him, and so in the end, it wasn't worth keeping, because it's another way of addressing the audience also. But I think the more I look at it as a very small piece, I really like. I think it's something to be looked 2 or 3 times, because there are already, like, every time with about too many information. But basically, I mean, as a thought, it's really interesting. Is that the politics starts at the moment where imitation ceases, and so it's getting out again. I would say getting out of the realist trap, of this idea of that also that maybe that realism is just a copy of the real. Bart would say it's a copy of a copy. But I think much more, it's the interesting thing for me is this idea of constructivism, and how this montage-based technique, but it's also much more a Benjamin concept, how you can blast spaces and recollect pieces and work from a perspective which is yours actually, and which is from a point of view or from a situation where you are in demand, or where the situation urges you to produce something. So this is again the impossibility to speak without taking a position, and so being able to choose the position, your position within the story also. So I think it's really important also in this idea of getting out of the trap of the academization of documentary, for example. And for this film, it was also very problematic, because I had a witness who couldn't really, or who wouldn't testify the way, of course, you expect him to speak about his experience, his colonial experience. And the moment where it happens is a moment where he makes a slip, he makes his lapsus by inverting or rephrasing the phrases of the French anthem, the French hymn, and saying instead of where he's chanting, instead of saying "Allons enfants de la patrie," he says "Allons enfants de la tyrannie," and this is only, I think that there's this incredible moment, which is only possible because at some point there is a documentary protocol which is installed in order to make something happen. Although I think in the end the film is using documentary protocol, so it's completely related to the codes of realism, but I think in a totally other construction.
I mean, I think that the emphasis on another kind of social realism is in some ways perhaps more productive than just the emphasis on montage or the cut-up or the construction, because this is, Vincent made me go back and read something I wrote in 1992, critiquing social constructivism as it's coming out of the field of social science at the time, where it's very much trying to appropriate more radical efforts at critique by making a science, so to speak, of the construction of language discourse, so to speak. And so here I think the emphasis on another kind of social realism that then does what is stronger in a way, because there are multiple, it gives you the options for how you make that. Because sometimes it's even less like, for example, I mean, I was really thinking about this in relationship to the Breitenau project, because it could be, I was working with a conceptual photographer who is adamantly opposed to anything that smacked of documentary.
But still, it looks a lot like documentary photograph.
Okay, yeah, I didn't take the photographs. I'm just telling you, this was the principle under which I was collaborating. And at the same time, the entire work of the project was an enormous amount of historical archival research. I mean, that's all we were doing. And so for me, there was something also a little bit off in this, that the methodology of the work itself was going to be very hard in the end to produce something that wasn't particularly documentary. It was a huge amount of work for me to do the writing so that what appeared was not a historical document, but in fact fragments of an alternative history that I had to basically invent. It was quite a lot of work. And I'm not sure I would do it again quite that way, but what became, I think, really important for me was what was the alternative social realism that was the principle guiding the work, and that was, I really took that from Bloch and the idea of something he calls the utopian surplus. You know, that all of life has utopian margins, and what might it mean to tell the history of Western Europe from the 12th century to, you know, the 1973, according to this idea. But it was difficult because on the one hand it's over-documented, and on the other hand it's, you know, like it could be anywhere. Anyway, I think that the principle of the alternative social realism is the stronger one, the better guide than a particular
I'm not so
tool
sure about
for it.
because if you relate to this, of course, it's trapped also in terms of what it calls back as a pattern recognition, just by saying this. So I'm not sure, because I think again in this work is there's a lot of fabulation, there's a lot of rewriting, and so this is more like how you challenge the social dimension of it through writing, and how you reconsider it through writing. That's what you call also sociography in comparison to sociology.
Okay, people are leaving. Questions, other questions you have, or things you would like to say from up there in the heights?
It was not clear to me that all the paintings, not the first ones but the last ones, who made them? Were it black people or white people that made them? That was not clear.
From the test. So you mean from the back?
Paintings with these elongated figures and this kind of.
Yes. So these are plates from the Congo Tieti, like the photographs, and it was a commission that Ombredan asked to a young painter. For the small anecdote, it's quite interesting. He was the first one to win the young jeune peinture belge, along with Pierre Alechinsky. But we forgot this guy. I made some research. I cannot find any. It's a white guy, but it's interesting because the commission came with the demand that the drawings should be done as based on Chokwe sculpture. So African sculpture, very well known. The Chokwe ethnic also is one of the most beautiful type of sculpture. So it's very weird, of course, because
I mean, they're much more, I see if I can they are so much more beautiful as images, though, compared to the original ones, which are very ugly. See if I can, I don't have them scanned, but they look like this. These are the ones that were made for African Americans.
So these are really
Can you actually see?
It is the black US T80.
Yeah, so
so it's a remake of the.
They are exactly the same, exactly the same images. except they have blackface, we would say, almost literally.
But they've been redrawn, huh? So it's
they've
not
been
like
redrawn.
they pasted on it, but they ask someone to make exact the same image with the.
Professor Dillard of the University of Tennessee made these drawings.
In America, it's a tradition of repainting people black and then pretending they're black. They also do it with red skin. In film, for instance, like the first motion picture with sound,
But if you,
like minstrels, but it was white people repainting.
but interestingly, I mean, these are not minstrel faces. These are, I mean, the faces on these are very interesting. They look like actors. And anyway, that's interesting about these, but they're completely different than the Congo ones
Yeah.
that at least
But-
presume an African visual style.
So it gave birth to a sort of fashion at that period after that Ombradan made his test. Like the test was adapted in a lot of other countries where people said, okay, but then I have to make my own version. And so there are like
The Swazi
a lot
ones
of
are really bizarre.
different versions. So it could be also a compilation of all those.
Of all the versions. Or it could just be a comment, if someone wants to make a comment.
I'm very fascinated by this, of course, this Giladello. Is he an artist or not? That's, I think, the biggest question, as he was instrumentalized in a way by his administrator. What would be your set of parameters to evaluate him as an artist?
But my answer would be very simple. I think that basically what it brings back to the question is how we can address the idea of artist as a concept itself, as an abstraction, as a construct. And you could say, yeah, it's easy to say that, but I think again, it's like, for me, the big fascination, since I'm trying to understand the relationship between what I call coloniality, it's not colonization as an historical sequence, but coloniality is like a matrix of power which is applying in our daily lives, where there are traces of that matrix everywhere. And so coloniality is not only about colonization, but colonization was a sort of experimental terrain for experimenting solutions of segregating and all that stuff that we know. But so the big fascination is to see how so many things that we use, that we take for granted, of course, are so recent as construct. And yeah, I mean, think about Barthes and Foucault, thinking about what is an author. It was in '67 where they kind of gave us a better understanding on how the author was a construction historically based, and I think that's the big quality also of your work, of always thinking in terms of power relations. I think again here I said it's far Gilatendo, but it's not that far, of course, because we can recognize some images. And I think when I said in the beginning, the frame of intelligibility is also about how we can understand ideas and abstraction we always use. Like I present myself, I'm an artist, okay. Of course we know how it has been a long formation as a concept, and how we can think about the atelier and in the 17th century here in Flanders, where works were not signed, and so all those questions, they are part of our own history. But yeah, I think that the very interesting question for me about Gilatendo is basically looking back onto your own practice. How would you define the border zone between what you considered as being your artistic work and what's not, or like, is it part of the artistic practice or not? Yes, I think it is part of it, of course. So in that term is also the artist as a cultural practitioner more than as a define persona or a genius. Of course this not, but even not as a persona who has to invent a specific role. So I think this concept of artist is also so moving and so changing. If we look back at even 10 years back, and I think this position is the position to be reinvented. That's why I'm so fascinated also by Gil Attendo, how he reworked his name. You know, it's just like more like again, look at it as. Of course, it's a complete misappropriation what I do, like saying, okay, it's a pre-conceptual gesture. Of course, it cannot be looked that way, but it's a sort of also of not a provocation, but a sort of mirroring, a mirroring gesture, or how I can, you know, look at the ability to reinvent yourself just by this very detailed move, I would say, even move, you know, how this just a few letters, and then you could consider that something is move for always, if you look properly at it, or in a certain perspective. So yeah, I would say, is he an artist or not? I mean, it's how you can reconstruct him as an artist also, which needs to be done somehow, because we need to address this work properly. And that's what I try to do also with the show, by having him as a guest, is like getting him out of the art history, the Congolese art history, which is always been produced by Belgium since now, where we show what is the modern art in Congo. And then we have this long line, you know, it's like this temporality with a forefather, and it's with Gil Attendo and Lubaki, and where you put next to each other artists who, yeah, they share probably the same territory, but it's as stupid as if we would make a Belgian art exhibition, and it happens every 3 to 4 years, but I think it's completely ridiculous to do it like that. So I think what is needed is to organize a framework in order to have a better look onto this work, and how it can actually be challenged as something which still is carrying a lot of questions and a lot of energy in itself, also how it can be animated in that way as something which generates new questions, and that is still valid as a not only as images, but as something which challenges as artists today.
Mm.
When you say that your own point of view is also white Western point of view?
Of course, I mean, of course it is. But then the challenge is how to see how this work can, you know, is, for example, I just answer this question another way. I would be so glad if I could show Gil Attendo within not this framework, but just, you know, his own work in Congo, because the thing is that he's considered as a forefather here, while there nobody knows him, because his work has been made for here. So there's a very strange relationship. Again, it's like looking at the colonial archive in Europe. They're here. They're in France, they're in the UK, in Belgium. Massive tons of archive of artifacts. And it's always the same argumentation, you know, they don't take care of their own history, So it's the same old story, always. And so you could say, you could compare this. I just don't want to speak about these work as archive, because I think they deserve much more attention and they have much more value. That it's not a question of value, it's a question of how you can show them as work of arts that challenge new perspective on our shared history, because that's all about that. It's about the colonial history, and this relationship between coloniality and modernity there's a question of, there's a story of a reciprocal possession, I think. So there's no way to look at it as, you know, separate stories. It's just like a intermixed, entangled story, and we have to consider them as this relationship, in terms of social relationship, of course, but in terms of relationship and I would say also of possessions, of mutual possessions, let's say.
Thank you.